done the first time I was elected. I was nominated by the Secretary General following a series of interviews, and then he sounded out the permanent five, the US, Russia, China, and the UK.
I wasn't willing to try, lest I be drawn into having to compromise. This office needs to maintain its independence. The term of a High Commissioner should be limited to 1 5-year or 6-year period, and that's it.
So you think you would have got 5 straight vetoes, including from the United Kingdom and France?
Possibly, yes, possibly. I have irritated, I think, all governments over the course of the 4 years. And I'm not sure that they would have approved me for a second.
But High Commissioner, have you not reflected on why that may be the case, and that perhaps, as your critics have said, you've been far too outspoken? I mean, Russia has accused you of being irresponsible and hopes that your successor will learn from your failures. The Chinese have said similar things about you. The United States is no fan of yours. Hasn't it made you want to scratch your head and think, have I done something wrong?
Yeah. No, look, Zainab, we work with all governments. We have offices throughout the world. We extend our desire to establish a sort of technical arrangement where we can help them with their human rights obligations. But let us be absolutely clear. The governments can defend themselves. I'm not there to defend them. I'm there to defend their people who are discriminated against, who are deprived of their rights, who are seeing their freedoms disappear at an alarming rate. Those are the people that I'm here to defend.
Were you under pressure to moderate your language and tone down the criticisms, perhaps from the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres?
Well, at various times it was made known to us, and it's not just something that I have felt, but I think all my predecessors have felt it likewise, that yes, for the rest of the UN system, we can come across as being either too sanctimonious and irritant, that we're disruptive. We don't see it like that.
But were you asked specifically to tone down your language?
In the beginning, yes, I was. It was suggested I could have used alternative vocabulary, not so much toning it down, but perhaps less terse, less aggressive. I still pursued my own way of doing it, irrespective of what was said to me.
For example, you called President Donald Trump dangerous.
Yes.
Did you also call him a bigot?
We have called him that. There are a number of occasions where the President and many others have gone beyond what you expect the head of state or government to say, given the human rights obligations that they are supposed to meet. You know, Zainab, we have to somehow also detach the discussion about comparative values or how the ideological discussions play out in governments from human rights law, which is fixed, which imposes obligations, which countries have entered into voluntarily. What we say to them is, look, you know, where there are deficits, where you are not abiding by your obligations, we will highlight this. The shame is on you. We're not...
highlighting is one thing,
yes.
But to use language like that, I mean, for example, you've criticised the rise of the populist right, both in the United States and Europe, describing them all as demagogues and political fantasists who share the tactics of ISIL. Was it wise to compare supporters of, for example, Donald Trump with a terror group?
No, the point I was trying to make, there were two points. One is that they appeal in their narrative to a return to some form of disruptions of
globalization, by the arrival of migrants from other parts of the world that threaten a way of life, a culture. And in that, there is a similarity. The crimes committed by Daesh or ISIL are so repugnant, so extreme, that we would separate the two dimensions from each other. But where there is similarity, again, is the use of half-truths, right, to spin a particular narrative, to deceive, to make people think that there is a way out along a particular trajectory which would bring them salvation.
Are you accusing, for example, the American government of doing that?
I was accusing the populists.
People?
I was accusing the populists of being charlatans and deceivers, yes. And that's exactly what they are. We're not saying that the conditions which give rise to anxiety and fear, loss of jobs, loss of opportunities, are not real. Those are very real. What we're saying is that the populists play on those fears for self-interest, and because they know that it generally works. It's worked before in the past, in the short term, long term, disasters.
But look, you are a highly experienced diplomat. You served as Jordan's ambassador to the United Nations. You were instrumental in helping set up the International Criminal Court. You've had experience in UN peacekeeping. Surely you must know that the role of a diplomat is to engage in a constructive manner. And I tell you what the Chinese have said. They say you are duty-bound to work in a constructive manner with respect for sovereignty and to avoid public pressure. Could you have used that kind of approach? Might it not have yielded more?
No. One is that I used to be a diplomat. I'm not a diplomat in this position. I'm an international civil servant. The
vulnerable, the victims of human rights abuses. That's how I see my mandate. Yes, we work with governments. I'm not saying that our office only occupies itself with being loud and terse and beating governments around the head. We don't see ourselves as doing that. But I'll give you an example. There was a foreign minister who I needed to reach because we were planning to send a technical team to that country. For almost a year, the foreign minister ignored us completely. I tried repeatedly to speak to them. Eventually, we said we're going to go public. The very next day, he was willing to speak.
You don't want to say which country that is?
No, because we actually see improvements in that country.
Because you don't want to use the public pressure, so you realise it has its benefits sometimes.
Yes, exactly.
But, I mean, now we are in the situation where, as I said, you've made criticisms about the United States, for example, over the migration policy of separating families that we saw taking place. Nikki Haley, the American ambassador to the United Nations, has accused you of being a hypocrite and of being ignorant in your attacks on the United States. And so they've now withdrawn from the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is not under your mandate, but it is part of the United Nations human rights family. So when criticisms are so overt, that's what it leads to, disengagement, and that's not helpful, is it?
Well, I'm not sure the two are connected. The ostensible reason is, and probably is the real reason as well, is that...
Why the US withdrew from
Why the US withdrew
recently.
Is that the demands that the US laid out for the reform of the Human Rights Council had not been met, and that triggered then the withdrawal. It coincided with the issue of the separation of families. And yes, we did speak out, and I said it was unconscionable, and it is unconscionable. And very few countries, if any at all, practice that. And but it just was a moment in time when the two came together and may have given the appearance that...
well, it was. I mean, well, I tell you what the US National Security Advisor John Bolton said the reason why that the United States withdrew from the Human Rights Council was because the Council and you, the High Commissioner, are fundamentally misdirected and misguided. They don't advocate human rights. They've actually been used by human rights abusers against the United States.
I mean, it's a remarkable comment. I know John Bolton. I used to work with him when I was an ambassador. It's really bizarre. I mean, we produce reports on countries the world over. We have taken the UN into areas where hitherto the UN had no light cast in these particular parts of the world. For instance, we produced a report most recently on Turkey, a succession of reports from remote monitoring exercises. We've done the same on Kashmir, we've done the same on Venezuela. We look at all countries without privileging any or discriminating against any. So to say that somehow we're singling out a particular country, and many countries say this, and
no,
it's frankly not true.
It's the Council, which I know, as I say, is actually a body from the General Assembly, and it's made up of 47 countries, and they're elected on a rotating basis, on a regional basis as well. However, it's all part of the UN human rights infrastructure, and how they perform, you accept, has an impact on your activities. So when Donald Trump in September last year says it's an embarrassment that there are countries on the UN Human Rights Council that have themselves committed atrocities, That does make it difficult for you to do your job, doesn't it? It does erode credibility.
Well,
do you accept that?
I mean, let's put it into perspective. There is an argument, and there was an argument made, that only those with the most pristine human rights records could be on the council, or should be on the council. That it doesn't exist. You don't have a country that is meeting presently all its human rights obligations. At the other extreme, you have those who have severe human rights violations on their ledger, and they are not on the human rights count. You don't have Syria, you don't have,
right? So they are not members. And action has been taken by the membership to prevent them. The vast majority of countries have a very varied sort of record. Many have seen advances when it comes to the rights of women, the rights of children, ending the use of the death penalty, the advances where the LGBTI community are concerned. At the same time, though, we see regression in areas related to migration, immigration, treatment of racial minorities, ethnic minorities, and so forth. So it's a patchy record for many countries. And where do you draw the line on who should be on and who should be off? So it is a discussion primarily for the governments, as you said, not so much for us. What we insist on...
Don't you accept, though, that it does impinge on
absolutely.
What you do?
No, it does. It does, yes.
If there's
absolutely.
a loss of credibility, then there is for you.
Absolutely.
You just mentioned the death penalty now, and I just want to raise with you an issue which is exciting a lot of debate in the United Kingdom. And, of course, there have been more than 100 British jihadis who've been stripped of their nationality, yes. And 2 in particular now who it is said that the British government has said that they can be tried in the United States and perhaps, if they're found guilty, see the death penalty being carried out. They're currently being held in Syria by Syrian Kurds. I mean, would you offer any kind of human rights guidelines on this particular issue?
Well, the human rights law, where it stands, creates an exception when it comes to the use of the death penalty, in the sense that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights provides for it. On the other hand, the trend is to move toward the ending of its use. And that's what we're pushing for. We're pushing for governments that are practicing it or have lapsed back into practicing it to basically suspend its use, at least have a
penalty. Yet
we would not
the Brits have. Yes. You wouldn't support Theresa May's government in doing.
No, we would advocate that if they are vulnerable to the use of the death penalty, we would very much advise against it. There is no judiciary on this planet that is mistake-free, that can discharge its judicial functions free of mistake. And so long as that is the case, and quite aside from the moral arguments that you can bring into this, what happens to their families, of those who are executed, the children who suffer for the rest of their lives, those in the administration of justice system who are traumatized for years and years. I mean, all those arguments can be also brought in, but ultimately, no, they should not be exposed to the penalty.
And of course, another issue which often generates a lot of debate in the United Nations is the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And that's one particular aspect that the United States, along with Israel, of course, criticizes the United Nations for. So again, when it comes to the UN Human Rights Council, for example, it singles out Israel like no other country. Out of more than 300 specific resolutions the Council has passed in the last 12 years, 76 deal with Israel, 27 with Syria, and 20 with Myanmar. Do you accept that there is an anti-Israel bias in the United Nations, including the UN Human Rights Council and perhaps even your own office?
Well, in the Council, it is 47 countries that collectively make decisions. I have repeatedly asked for investigations, for instance, in Venezuela, and they haven't been met by the Human Rights Council. I've asked most recently for an investigation into one in Nicaragua. We had no response. I've had to spend 3 years lobbying the Human Rights Council for an investigation into Yemen, and finally we got it.
But I was asking this.
Now, I'll get to this point. And so the thing is, we can, put forward a request. Ultimately, these governments, 47 governments, have to make the decision themselves.
I mean, I'll give you an example.
But you yourself have been criticised, for example, by the pro-Israel watchdog UN Watch. Says all of the United Nations has an anti-Israel bias, but it says about you, your tenure is one of almost complete disregard when it comes to fighting anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I don't really accept this. Look, if we look at what it is that I have said about anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, racial discrimination, usually we cover all these issues in the same context. It is the case that anti-Semitism is very evident now, not just in Europe, but in the Arab world, the part of the world where I come from, and in other parts of the world. And it is toxic, and it is very alarming. That we can do better on all these particular files, there's no doubt. But I don't accept the suggestion made that somehow I'm anti-Semitic, or my office is, or all the experts who deal with human rights are, I find that repugnant.
You say it's incumbent on states to maintain human rights for their citizens. So what is your response to the recent move by the Israeli Knesset, where a slim majority approved the law saying that only Jews have the right to self-determination, downgrading Arabic as an official language for the 1.8 million Israeli Arabs? What was your view?
Well, it's clearly discriminatory. I don't see how else you could describe it. I mean, it's certainly privileging one part of Israeli society over another, and there's no other way to describe it. And I don't know how one would argue otherwise.
Looking at your own region, the Middle East, but also obviously the wider Muslim world, there have also been criticisms that perhaps you haven't done enough to promote freedom of speech when it comes to expressing religious beliefs. And we saw one particular case in your native Jordan where a journalist was shot dead as he entered a court where he was going to stand trial for blasphemy. Do you feel you have done enough in this area?
I think we have. In the sense that the problem we have with the way that the blasphemy laws are conceived and then applied is that often they're so ill-defined that they're used for political reasons to silence those who are express dissent, as you rightly point out, or political opponents of a government, journalists, bloggers, and so forth. And we have spoken out about this. We've seen vigilantism in Pakistan and Bangladesh. I've spoken about this publicly in Indonesia. We've seen similar manifestations in Aceh. I mean, clearly, we can always do more, and I can always speak more forcefully. But I think we've done enough in terms of highlighting the problem and asking governments to take the appropriate action.
And the Kashmir report that you published this year, first ever report on human rights violations in both Indian and Pakistani administered Kashmir. Indian government very, very cross about your actions, accused you of ulterior motives, and the Deputy Permanent Representative to the UN says the report reflects the clear bias of an official, that's you, who was acting without any mandate whatsoever and relied on unverified sources of information. Water off a duck's back?
I mean, I don't know how to respond to it. I mean, look, it's ridiculous. I mean, the claim is ridiculous. Let's go back to July 2016, when we first had this massive disruption, let's put it this way. I mean, unrest, where the use of pellet guns, say, look, we have to
put a stop to this. Now, if you look at the development of this, at the very beginning of the crisis, we said we want access to both sides of the line of control. We demanded and requested, let's say, not demanded, unconditional access to both sides. The Pakistanis gave us conditional access, which we were not in favor. We did not avail ourselves of it. The Indian side did not. Now we have all this, invective, this emotion and hysteria that I'm biased, that I'm jihadi, that I'm working with ISI. It's nonsense. I mean, complete nonsense. Most of the sources were Indian sources, were from Indian institutions. 322 footnotes referencing, or basically much of it comes from Indian institutions, publicly available material. And so it's not an argument.
I mean, Edward Mortimer, who worked as the Director of Communications for former Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, says the international climate now has become notably less favourable when defending human rights. Would you agree with that? And if so, why? Why?
Well, look, we are seeing, as I have noted at the beginning of this interview, we've seen huge advances over the last 60, 70 years when it comes to women's rights, child rights, trying to end the practice of torture, enforced disappearances, trying to improve the climate for migrant rights, the rights for persons with disabilities. That's undeniable. That has happened. We are now moving in a different direction, where the attack is on the international system as a whole. And we have the exiteers, the firsters, the national, let's say the ethnic nationalists, the chauvinistic nationalists, who are trying to create policies on the basis of very narrow agenda.
And is that in the vanguard is Donald Trump? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I would maybe say Viktor Orban is the
Prime Minister of Hungary.
Prime Minister of Hungary. I mean, Viktor,
on his own, leading this huge global movement that you described?
Look what he said back in March. I said so publicly. He said in a public statement, I do not want people of my color to mix with people of another color, right? Clear racism. When you look at Hungary, a country of almost 10 million people, do you know how many Afro-Hungarians there are in the country? There are about 1,300.
Sure.
And the population that has now voted in Fidesz again, right? How xenophobic it is. I mean, there's a reality, and then there's.
Are you really saying Viktor Orban is at the spearheading this whole kind of
not spearheading in Europe?
Movement?
In Europe, he's providing an example of what seems to be a workable logic in political terms, in terms of securing and maintaining power.
And his foreign minister, of course, Peter Szijjártó, rejects your comments, which you've just laid out, says unworthy of your position and you should resign. That's their position.
I respectfully disagree with the foreign minister.
Finally, what do you think you have done in your time to advance the cause of human rights globally? You think you've really made a change?
Well, I think what I've been able to do is continue the trajectory that I inherited from my predecessors. And that is give voice without fear or favor in support of those most vulnerable, those who need the voice of an office like ours. We simply cannot treat all these disasters as if they were the product of some natural phenomena, a flood here, force majeure, an earthquake. Much of the suffering of people is caused by humans. And it's not just that we need to focus, you as the international media and ourselves, on the plight and the grievous suffering of individuals. We need to look at who's causing this suffering and say to them, look, you are not getting a pass. You are not getting a pass. And we are going to speak. And we're not going to let you forget this. We have lived through too much trauma in the 20th century to begin to relive it again. And we believe that there is so much energy out there, that there's so many people who believe likewise. It's just we have to mobilize them in the right direction.
Za'ed Alhusein, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you so much.